This is episode 1, The Risk Matrix Mitigated. My name is Nick Dingemans. I'm a corporate energy partner based in Singapore. Before we start, a couple of housekeeping matters. Please note all your microphones have been muted and your cameras turned off centrally. Please keep them off throughout the webinar. For Q&A, please submit your questions via the chat function at any time during the webinar, either to everybody or to me directly, and we'll pick the questions up then. The webinar is being recorded, and the recording and the slides will be made available to all those who registered for the webinar afterwards. So let's get started. I'm joined today by my colleagues Heike Trishman, Joe McGladdery and Daisy East, who are all based in London, and I'm based in Singapore. Our contact details are there on the page if you would like to contact any of us directly. The agenda today is set out on the page. Heike and I are going to cover the majority of the session on the risk matrix and how it can be mitigated using contractual tools and structuring tools. Joe and Daisy are going to do a brief session both on financing of FSRUs and financing of power plants, and that's a bit of a teaser for a webinar they will be doing later in the year, probably September, October, going into much more detail on those financings. We'll also be running a webinar in early August with colleagues in Vietnam, looking at gas to power in the Vietnamese market and the trends that are developing there. So please watch out for those webinars closer to the time. So as the world transitions to a net zero future, I personally think that LNG will be a key component of that transition. As BP indicated in its BP Statistical Review for 2020, coal remains a dominant energy source in the global energy mix. Natural gas, and as a consequence LNG, especially when you can mix ultimately natural gas with hydrogen and potentially produce natural gas from synthetic biofuels, means that LNG should have a prominent position in our transition to net zero. As part of that, displacing coal-fired power and other power sources with LNG-powered sources over the next 30 years will be very important. In the last 10 to 15 years, the LNG sector has evolved from the traditional point-to-point LNG delivery system to a more dynamic and integrated market with different market participants and different market components. This changing market has been facilitated by modular construction, particularly floating modular construction in the form of floating LNG and in the form of FSRUs. In addition to the change in the equipment, there's also been changes in the sales models. The development of the LNG aggregator and ultimately the development of pure LNG traders is also changing that dynamic. The combination of the ability of the aggregators to sell on other terms other than long-term, so short-term spot and medium-term, as well as changes in the pricing mix, mean the market is completely changing to that long-term point-to-point. These changes are actually enabling the LNG to power market themselves, allowing new buyers to come in because they can buy from LNG aggregators and traders rather than relying on long-term offtake from fixed liquefaction plants. As you can see on this slide, the traditional LNG value chain is complemented at the end by the power aspect and changed by the addition of an FSRU. The traditional scope of this is something we'll step through over the next couple of slides. These are important to understand as the basis for the ultimate risk matrix. We're going to concentrate on what I call the downstream portion, the FSRU through to the power plant today. But as you can see from this slide, the project-on-project risk is inherently from the entire value chain. So let's look at the upstream. the traditional upstream hasn't really changed. We have host governments, we have producers, obviously you have a licensing regime, and then ultimately you need to process the hydrocarbons you pull out of the ground. Obviously the upstream infrastructure needs to be built out, and the players include the different lenders and construction companies at this point. The project on project risk moves on, so you have the gas sales to a marketing entity, transportation to market through pipelines. Doesn't matter whether it's a long or a short distance, there will be a pipeline infrastructure, and often that will be another set of pipeline operators, different again to the upstream operators. And finally, we deliver the gas to the LNG liquefaction plant. As I said, we've changed in some respects with the development of floating LNG. So plants like Prelude are starting up now. We also have other emergence of nearshore floating through gravity-based foundations. So you have developers like Novatec and Total with Arctic LNG 2 using gravity-based foundations built in Murmansk and floated round to the Yamal area. And they're also building transshipment terminals with the same technology. So again, the project on project risk moves on, and we have another set of players in the liquefaction. We then move to the traditional midstream. So we start with our liquefaction. Then we've got to get sell our LNG. So in this case, the aggregators brings in potential again for trade finance and structured finance as the traders and aggregators build their portfolios. And then we move on to the delivery of the the molecules to end users through LNG carriers, bringing in another set of players, the vessel operators, the vessel owners, and again the asset finance of those vessels. And then finally we come to our delivered molecules. The LNG carrier delivers to the FSRU. That then creates another set of players in terms of the FSRU operator, potentially a separate owner or a syndicate of owners, again another group of lenders, potentially onshore infrastructure, and then we deliver the gas that's been regasified either directly to the power station or in some markets to industry itself, or a combination of both. Again, then you have another set of lenders potentially, and the power purchase agreement delivering those electrons to end users. So we're going to concentrate on this structure, this final part of the structure, the downstream portion, and the risks inherent in the project on project nature of this and the different market participants. So let's have a look at that structure once again. And here I've set out the key risks from a sponsor's point of view. So these are the pretty traditional risks that you would see in any infrastructure build out, but we have them at least doubled up because we have the FSRU and we have the power plant. Potentially we have a third layer, which is transmission lines and other onshore terminal infrastructure. And you also have the component of the LNG supply. And we'll talk about a little bit more about the risks inherent in that when Heike speaks. But if you look around these key risks, they're not unfamiliar. Force majeure, permitting, procurement defects, cost overruns, etc. I'm going to be looking at how we can use upfront corporate structuring to de-risk some elements of this project on project risk. So let's turn to those structures now. Set out here is the traditional matrix of risks. So on this first slide, we're looking at the key larger risks. The grayed out section is what Heike will speak to shortly. I'm going to be addressing how you use corporate structuring to address some of these. And then on this slide, these are more the local issues or the on-site issues in the jurisdiction that we're talking about. And again, The greyed out areas are the areas Heike will talk to, and procurement and permitting I will deal with the corporate structuring. So let's have a look at these corporate structures. First of all, we see the traditional standalone model. Separate FSRU sponsor, separate power sponsors, and no interaction between either of them. Obviously, this is the classic project-on-project structure conflict, and how we allocate the risk between the FSRU and the power, and obviously, again, the next player is the power off-taker, and going the other way is the LNG supplier. Who is best placed to take these risks? Who is best placed to mitigate these risks? These are questions both for sponsors and for lenders, but from a sponsor point of view, one element of being able to de-risk this is cross-ownership. Not always possible in some jurisdictions where local law won't permit it for foreign ownership restrictions, or there's monopolies that need to be complied with. But these cross-ownerships can go either way. So FSRU can take some equity in the power, or power can take some equity in the FSRU. And we'll see when we come to the case studies how this has been used in real life, in actual financed and built projects. Finally, we have what I think is probably the neatest solution, which is the integrated approach. I've thrown all the participants up as sponsors. You don't necessarily always have this, you'll have a combination of them. But by bringing everybody into the equity, everybody has an interest in the overall project, everybody has skin in the game, so to speak, and using a corporate structure, you can de-risk elements of the transaction. Everybody is interested in the timetable of when things will start to flow. Each of the parties will still, of course, have their own contract into the structure. So the FSRU operator will have an O&M, the LNG aggregator will have a master sale and purchase agreement of some kind, the generating company will have power purchase or tolling or whatever the structure is, and obviously the off-taker will have the power off-take. But by bringing everybody into the same structure, using the equity, you bring everybody in into the game. This can obviously be used to facilitate things like delay, because everything gets coordinated. It can also help with procurement because you're procuring through a single large joint venture structure. And as you'll see when Heike speaks, there are a number of other benefits to bringing everybody together. So these are the structures all sitting together. Obviously, no one structure works for all jurisdictions. There's no one size fits all. Local laws will require certain structures, and as you'll see when we come to the case studies, those local requirements will drive you one way or another. However, these corporate structures are just the first building block of the overall de-risking process. So I'm going to pass over to Heike now to look in more detail at the contracting strategies and the contractual toolbox that we can use. Thanks, Heike.
Thanks, Nick. That's great. So the corporate structures Nick just talked about mandate, or to a certain extent facilitate, corresponding contractual structures, of course. So starting with the integrated project structure, both from a corporate and from a contractual point of view, that will be usually, as Nick said, a single project company in its purest way, which will purchase the LNG and owns and or hires and operates the FSRU and the associated infrastructure like the jetty and the unloading arms on shore, as well as the gas infrastructure and the power plant, and then sells the power to often government-owned utility off-takers. This is, as Nick said, perhaps the simplest model and avoids certainly separate project entities with resulting contractual complexities between them, as we can see in the models further down. However, it's still quite difficult to finance this and pull it off the ground, and as a result, we actually see very few what I would call true integrated projects around. This is particularly true for projects with a single gas source, as was traditionally the case. So in-country gas production, for example, by people like Total in Nigeria, and then a single off-taker like a power plant, because obviously all the risks actually sits within the integrated project company, and the participants, the sponsors, need to be well equipped basically to deal with them, and that is quite often the case then that gas majors like Total or ExxonMobil, for example, are being either sponsors or actually take the entire project forward on their own, sometimes on balance sheet, avoiding project finance altogether. So one of the examples recently is the Kanbauk project between Total and Siemens in Myanmar, but even that has stalled for the moment because of various issues. Where an integrated project is not appropriate, for example, as Nick said, because of specific regulatory restrictions on ownership between gas and power, or, for example, where there's a mandatory third-party access requirement in the market for the gas or LNG infrastructure, or, in fact, where there are parts of the supply chain already developed. So that could be, for example, the gas market is already developed, or there are already IPPs on a CCGT basis. So then, obviously, a non-integrated contractual structure needs to be put in place, and that probably equates to something like either the standalone or the cross-ownership, as Nick said. So this then mandates at least a gas hub and an IPP company to be in place. And contractually, this could translate into a back-to-back structure, as we see here next in the slide, which is likely the most complex structure, creating obviously multiple counterparty performance risks and interface risks, and probably should best be avoided in its purest form. So that then leaves perhaps the most common and manageable, certainly at the moment with the companies around, contractual structure, which is the tolling structure, where usually a government entity buys LNG and tolls it through the FSRU, which is then owned or chartered and operated by what I would call HubCo, and then the IPP takes the gas via an energy conversion agreement. The gas can, as Nick said, also be sold separately by HubCo to gas customers, if that's available, if those are available. And if the buyers along the chain are sufficiently creditworthy, then this will avoid credit support either being required by HubCo and or the IPPs, or at least the requirements could be reduced, which is an advantage for this model. So where there is already mandatory third-party access requirement in the market, obviously that will allow increased access to customers, and then those customers will obviously quite often look for multiple LNG supply sources to be put in place, and that then basically mandates requirements for multiple access agreements, either to the FSRU infrastructure or to the gas pipeline infrastructure, or both. And that could again create complexities, this time around scheduling, nominations, LNG quality to a certain extent, and any resulting mismatch along the chain. So that needs to be carefully controlled as well contractually. These risks can also be mitigated by putting in place an aggregator entity, as Nick has already mentioned, which could either be equipped with shipping capacity, as we see in the Malta project, where then this aggregator can take cargoes FOB and be responsible for managing the shipping part of the LNG supply. but it could also be a local LNG buyer, gas selling marketeer who either owns the FSRU and gas infrastructure or tolls through it. So as we have seen, the more project companies there are, the higher the contractual complexities and project-on-project risks arising. So in the following two tables, which Nick had already flashed at you kind of earlier, we have set out a number of risks and most commonly used contractual mitigants. But actually there are too many to go into this during this webinar, obviously. So we leave these with you, the first one being the sort of key project risks, and the second one being the more local market risks, which are probably, well, the combination of which is important for project financing, but particularly also the downstream host country risks. So we will be concentrating on looking at some of the risks, or rather the mitigants, which are perhaps more specific to LNG and LNG to power projects in particular. So the first of these risks we would like to look at is counterparty credit risk. And although this is not actually unique to LNG either, it's still relatively new in LNG projects, which traditionally what Nick called employed, so to speak, A to B transportation and sales. So it relied on anchor countries like Japan and South Korea, where creditworthy buyers created over the years offtake and payment track records, and thereby sufficiently basically were sufficiently established and showed their strength to underpin financing of an upstream liquefaction project. However, you know, recent slower demand growth in these traditional markets, and I would say probably actually all over the Western world, combined with supply competition from other fuels like nuclear, obviously oil, but also more renewable sources coming on stream, have now forced sellers to turn to emerging markets to sell their LNG into those. And these markets often have no buyer demand or payment history and pose issues of creditworthiness and sometimes even political risk. And also these projects are often quite a bit smaller, taking smaller quantities, and therefore not being ideal for basically underpinning large-scale project financing. And this could be the case, for example, in Ghana, where some of the projects being talked about are designed to just bridge the time for domestic gas production to come on stream. So like in any other project, really, sellers are therefore required to verify sustainability of demand and ability to honor payments all the way from the end user back to the LNG purchaser. And of course, in addition, seller will seek to incorporate other contractual tools, as we have set out here, which are not really new to the LNG market. And those could include government guarantees, or utility guarantees, and then the question, of course, arises: is can these be performed if the need arises? And it would probably be much better to also ask to enter into project implementation agreements, and also so-called host, which are so-called host government agreements, and then structure it in a corporate way and in a tax-efficient way, so that you make use of bilateral investment treaties, to which the host country is a party, and then if the host government agreement or implementation agreement gets breached, you can claim under those rather than in country under the guarantee. So once you have a project in place, then delays can occur. Particularly on the construction phase, which will obviously hamper the start of the cash flow being generated to pay off the loans, and interest charges and just sort of start accumulating as the delay risk emerges, and unless this is obviously effectively managed. So at a starting point, what you would do is contractually to pass through start dates, commissioning periods, acceptance tests, and all of this. But also the main contractual terms like liabilities for such delay, force majeure, and termination provisions. Where the contracts provide for liquidated damages payable on delay occurring, these should then be structured to keep the entire project whole to be most effective, but this may not actually be feasible given the cost intensity, particularly of the upstream project. And so to mitigate construction phase delay, LNG contracts will invariably these days contain diversion rights and often also the right to resell the cargoes or even the gas downstream, so destination clauses will be removed, as has been the case in Europe for some time. However, in my view, the best mitigation tool is to ensure that the LNG import facilities are in place first, so that the project can start creating revenues and reduce project-on-project risk. So this could be achieved, for example, if the LNG infrastructure is in place to offload LNG to trucks and create small-scale projects around the port, or even for the transportation sector in country. And obviously, if gas infrastructure is in place, then regasified LNG can be sold to gas customers, even if the power plant and or the transmission lines are not yet ready. So during the operational phase, obviously interruptions can also occur. So that could be due to outage or even on a demand side slump. And taking the demand side first, again, the main tool will be a pass-through, as we've already looked at, as we've already seen, sorry, of the main contractual terms. But now we are also looking basically to pass through things like maintenance periods, for example, where the FSRU has to go on dry dock due to class requirements, and particularly if there is no replacement FSRU inside available for that time. And then obviously also seasonal demand swings need to be passed through contractually. Again, the LNG sales agreement will need diversion rights, but actually the huge cost outlay and lead times involved in developing the LNG project will require volume certainty at the FID stage already, particularly for the sellers and the lenders, which was traditionally really achieved through locking in buyers long-term on take-or-pay obligations. In the old days, 100%, now coming down a little bit to 80%, perhaps 90%. But markets are changing, and whilst buyers have agreed to take this volume risk in the past, the recent changes in the LNG supply market, particularly because supply has started to outstrip demand, particularly, as I said, credit-worthy demand, have meant that buyers are in a position to start demanding contractual flexibilities. So that could be lower take-or-pay obligations, shorter contract terms, carry forward rights, certainty that make-up cargoes will be available, volume flexibilities, and particularly for volume flexibilities to accommodate seasonal swings, diversion rights, rights to resell the lot. And obviously this will put a lot of pressure on the sellers and actually change their traditional risk matrix. But that also means that it will in fact have the same effect on their lenders. And lenders and sellers have therefore actually never been very keen on taking volume risk. Flexibility will also come at a price, and therefore, in my view, mostly favor cost-efficient, long-established producers who perhaps have already paid off their project loans, for example, the Qataris and the US LNG producers. Still, even I think that this degree of flexibility may be quite difficult, if it is agreed, may be quite difficult to maintain once the market flips again into what we call a seller's market, where demand will outstrip supply, which many forecast to happen within the next 2 or 3 years due to the current capex postponement and reductions and new liquefaction projects being currently, as we can see, for example, the ExxonMobil onshore project in Mozambique. It may therefore be much better or easier or even essential for the buyer to mitigate this risk through portfolio buying, either itself or through an aggregator, which seems to become the model of choice quite fast, the aggregator being that. On the supply side, again, portfolio LNG purchase by the buyer can help with this, as it's probably unlikely that all of the LNG sources break down at once, really. If the supply disruption is in the LNG or gas part of the chain, it will obviously be helpful if the IPP can run on dual fuel, which would mean that it has some storage tanks available. But if this is the case, it will still be quite likely to be required to run on gas, at least for a certain minimum percentage, to ensure a gas demand is in place. And obviously the availability of LNG storage will be helpful to cushion supply and give demand flexibility, either in the form of onshore storage tanks or floating LNG storage barges. Turning to pricing and a little bit more on LNG demand. So whilst LNG pricing formulas are traditionally based on a link to the local or even regional fuel competitor, that could be oil, naphtha, or gas, for example, and it usually contains a floor and a ceiling to protect the buyer and the seller against major price spikes due to the oil and gas links, basically. The parties have traditionally, particularly in the longer term arrangements, given themselves the right to review the price formula periodically or upon the trigger of a certain event occurring, such as competing fuels changing, markets getting liberalized or restructured, tariffs getting introduced as a result, and liquidity in the market increasing constantly, particularly through the upcoming expiry, has already happened in the past, but particularly upcoming, of a number of long-term supply agreements, particularly in Asia, which will free up a large volume of LNG, further increasing liquidity, no doubt. Due to events like this and more demand coming up in Asia, the initial LNG, what I call drama or action, has largely moved away, unfortunately, from Europe to Asia. So Nick, bringing you back in, as this is your playground, what are you seeing in the market, and what are people saying will be the future in Asia?
Thanks, Heike. I've been based in Singapore since 2014. I was in Europe before that. I think when I arrived, there was something like 23 LNG traders registered in Singapore. By 2018, it was 45, and I haven't been able to find specific numbers for 2020, but I understand it's possibly over 60. So that's a combination of, the big aggregators, the Shells, the BPs, the Totals, etc. But it's a whole sort of smaller traders who are pure trader aggregators where that's starting to play out. I think from our point as legal advisors, that's created and driven by a couple of legal things that you highlighted, Heike. Destination clauses going, the ability to divert cargoes on long term, and also flexible volumes within those long terms. So the ability to adjust the annual contract quantity to some extent. I think that's also combining with that short, medium-term spots conversation that you have in terms of different portfolio approaches. So Singapore's really becoming the hub of all of that. The Singapore government's obviously provided some benefits to traders who relocate here with some good tax incentives. I think the other thing is clearly the pricing. We're seeing, I don't think we're going to see the end of oil indexed pricing, but we're seeing more and more national balancing point, Europe's TTF or US Henry Hub pricing coming into the indexation. And also JKM, the Japan Korea marker that Platts brought out in 2009, is now actually starting to be used quite extensively. And I think the final thing for that is we're starting to see a number of trading platforms, digital trading platforms coming into Singapore and actually being used. So I guess the one that's sort of most in the news at the moment is GLX, which seems to be getting quite a bit of traction. And I think this is just part of the overall trend of the move to the commoditization of the LNG price. And you know, looking to the future, we may even see LNG being as tradable as, say, crude oil or other oil products. And you may even see FSRU operators and power operators starting to take a merchant approach rather than relying on single source or small portfolios. So I think that's the future.
Well, that's really interesting. Of course, I, not wanting this to happen because I want the action to be in Europe. So I'm quite intrigued by this aggregator thing. So you said they obviously have the ability to trade and, destination clauses and resell and all of that. And we have seen, for example, Coral LNG in the Eni floating one in Mozambique, selling pretty much all of its LNG to BP as a portfolio player. But to me, I don't quite believe that that is the ultimate story, because in fact, if there continues to be a demand slump, I think, which we will see what happens, but if there continues to be a demand slump, then then basically the issue is just sort of driven down a step down the chain. But if the aggregator don't find a market, then the LNG cannot float on the water forever like oil can. And so, actually I think particularly like floating FLNG, which doesn't have enough storage, is going to have a real problem and potentially has to shut in production unless they do something like the Qataris apparently do or talk about, is blue hydrogen from their gas if they don't sell it as LNG. Would you agree, or do you have a different?
No, I agree. I think if you look at Singapore and the Singapore government, hydrogen and the mixture of hydrogen and LNG is the future. And I think that flexibility to be able to use carbon capture and storage or other technologies to create hydrogen from gas, whether that's SMR in terms of taking it straight out of the gas, or actually electrolysis by using the gas to generate power. I think that is highly likely to be part of our transition, and it's coming. I think
that's great.
I think the aggregators, like the Totals and the BPs and the Shells, they will start playing in that downstream portion. They will start creating those markets for themselves. I think the other thing to be watching in the new demand source is going to be LNG bunkering. Clearly dry bulk is moving to LNG. Containerized cargo ships will move to LNG, especially on the traditional big point-to-point destinations. We're working with one of the mining companies at the moment looking at LNG fueled vessels and potentially at bunkering joint ventures with some of the international oil companies. So it's another big source.
Yeah.
Great. So I will let you carry on.
Just briefly. Thank you. So looking now at some of the case studies, and really just very briefly, to be honest. So one of the projects, I'm sure some of the people in the audience know, we have worked on is the first LNG import project into Pakistan. Clearly lots of country risk because traditionally they tried to do this onshore, and with the floating technology coming on board more, obviously another option opened up, which was then grabbed by the government. Despite country risk and no creditworthiness really, no guarantees were available from the government, so everything is on letter of credit by the utilities. Because there was an established gas market based on domestic gas production already in place in Pakistan, and there was mandatory third-party access to the gas pipeline system and forecast to be introduced for the LNG infrastructure, what was chosen was basically a tolling structure where the local gas company, Sui Southern Gas Company, tolls the LNG, the gases, and the regasified LNG through the FSRU terminal, and then transports it to the customers. The customers actually not being just industry, but also CNG users, because traditionally in the transportation sector, they already had that option available, which makes it greener. The local gas companies have a very small balance sheet and no international exposure or credit ratings. So the buyer of choice, which versus the LNG sellers, which was put in place as a sort of quasi local aggregator, is PSO, Pakistan State Oil, which was known in the market, has a credit rating and a history of never having defaulted once when taking oil and oil products, as was their traditional market. So the baseload contract is with the Qataris and it's oil indexed. And then that, because of the stringent procurement rules, was set up under a government-to-government arrangement because it couldn't really be tendered. Long-term arrangements doesn't suit itself for tendering. That base load was topped up with a midterm, which was 4 years and won by Gunvor, and was offered on basically topped up by spot cargoes, which were also tendered and were won by various different companies, Trafi, Gunvor, and so on. The 15-year tolling agreement is matched by a 15-year charter, and the local gas, the local gas hub company is Engro, and it charters the FSRU from Accelerate. And due to its fast-track nature, you can see here in record, not even a year, the project was financed off balance sheet initially by Engro and with IFC equity to finance the construction phase in particular, and then refinanced, allowing IFC to step out, and Vopak stepped in, and banks like ADB and Citigroup taking on the debt financing. So that's all I wanted to say on that. Over to you, Nick.
Thanks, Heike. The second case study is Jawa 1, LNG to power in Indonesia. This isn't a project we worked on, but we advised a bidder who missed out. This is a very good example of the integrated project with elements of cross-ownership. So the key project sponsors are Pertamina, the state's national oil company, Sojitz and Marubeni, and they, as you can see on the slides, control the power generating company. There's a separate FSRU SPV. Because of Indonesian law and the cabotage rules, the FSRU needs to be owned 51% by Indonesian parties. So Pertamina brought in Humpas, which is a shipping company in Indonesia, and MOL came in as an equity participant in the FSRU and also as the FSRU operator under an O&M. On the gas side, the LNG sourced from the BP-led Tanggoon LNG project in Indonesia. and bought under a long-term agreement between Tangoon participants and PLN, which is the National Power Generation Group. And then there is a 25-year PPA between PLN and the power generating company, SPV. So you can see everything integrated, some elements of cross ownership with MOL and Humpus only being in the FSRU. It was created as an integrated project but financed separately, but with certain cross defaults, and so a 25-year PPA and a 21-year tenor in terms of the financing. So I think this is a very good example of the mixture of those different contractual and corporate structuring tools that we talked about earlier. I'm now going to pass on to Joe McGladdery to give you a little taster of chartering of FSRUs and financing ahead of a fuller discussion later in the year. Now, Joe's been knocked off the internet and has come in by voice, so I'm hoping I can unmute him. No, I can't. Okay, I'm not sure how we'll do that, so I'll just quick. Oh no, Joe is on.
Nick, can you hear me now?
There you go. I can. Yeah, thanks, Joe.
Great. Great. Sorry about that. Would you believe the second time in the best part of 17 weeks that the internet fails, and it's 5 minutes before I'm due to come on to this webinar. So my apologies for that. But yeah, Nick, as Nick mentioned in relation to the introduction, we are looking to host a separate webinar later on in the year relating to the financing of LNG to power projects. And that will incorporate an overview of the commercial contracts relating to the FSRU, and in particular the FSRU charter. So just in terms of a very brief synopsis of what we will be covering, we'll be looking at the structures of FSRU charters in relation to both an integrated and standalone basis. And whilst FSRU charters are generally very bespoke on a project-per-project basis, they tend to fall into three categories, if you like. The first being relatively straightforward sort of vessel charter with the regasified element included within the charter, and we see this a lot now in relation to small-scale LNG to provide an additional level of flexibility. Perhaps more prominent in relation to LNG to power projects, it would be a separate lease and O&M arrangement where the operation maintenance function is performed by a locally incorporated operating company. And then again, thirdly, the service contract or towing arrangement, where the leasing itself of the vessel is very much secondary in nature to the provision of the regasified LNG. But irrespective of what a structure is adopted, the owner, of course, has various implied responsibilities within the contractual structure, and these relate from design and the construction or conversion of the FSRU at the shipyard to the positioning and installation of the FSRU at the site, and of course the crewing, operation and maintenance of the unit during the charter period. We'll also be looking briefly at the key commercial provisions within the FSRU charter in relation to the acceptance criteria that the FSRU is to comply with upon arrival at site. And this is important because ordinarily the regas performance of an FSRU cannot be tested whilst at the shipyard, and so there tends to be a very much a comprehensive regime contained within the charter dealing with the acceptance testing at the site, and we'll look at what happens if there are issues relating to the testing and deficient performance, and how these are to be rectified. And then once acceptance has taken place, we'll also look at the warranties that apply for the operational period, such as boil off, the regasified LNG discharge rate, how that rate can be varied to meet project demand, and of course how the deficiencies of any of these particular issues are dealt with in relation to the Charter, and of course its implications for the financing. So it's a very, very quick run through is what we'll be looking at on a separate webinar, and on that basis I'll pass on to my colleague Daisy East, who will have a brief look at the key features relating to the financing of an LNG to power project. Daisy, over to you.
Thanks, Joe. So this is a slide that we saw earlier, and I thought it would just be useful to set out again the risks, because they're the same risks for lenders as they are for equity. The extent of the risk and the mitigations required depend a lot on the structure that's been put in, and Nick and Heike have both talked about corporate and contractual structures that you can use to try to mitigate it. What works for sponsors and equity doesn't necessarily work for the banks and the lenders. They may need more robust mitigations in a number of areas, and we're going to look at that in more detail in our more in-depth seminar in the autumn. But to some extent, we can also use the finance structure to partially achieve some of that mitigation. And on the next slide, we can see here, firstly, we can see the typical providers of the financing for your LNG to power project: sponsors, commercial banks, export credit agencies, development finance institutions, multilaterals, and in some regions we see capital markets and institutional debt providers. But to some extent, you can use your finance structure to mitigate some of those risks that we saw on the previous slide. You know, export credit agencies provide a lot of coverage for political and natural force majeure, change in law, there's some protection there for currency as well, and of course sponsor completion guarantees will provide protection and coverage in respect of delay and maybe plant performance. So we'll be looking at all of those in more detail in the autumn, but we wanted to give you a flavour of the sort of additional gloss on the risk matrix that you get with financing. So back to Nick.
Thanks, Daisy. So that's the end of our formal presentation. If you have any questions, please submit them through the chat function, and I'm watching that now. So Heike, first questions come in, and I think you're the best one to deal with this. You mentioned the allocation of force majeure risk in your presentation, and the complexity of that depending on, you know, back-to-back tolling, etc. What are you seeing given COVID in terms of buyers and sellers in the current market with force majeure? We've heard the news that force majeure has been called. So what's your experience so far?
Thanks, Nick. That's actually quite good because, as you said, for the pass-through, obviously, if the FM clauses are not matching, then you're buggered, so to speak. So really, you would have to look at a case-by-case basis on these clauses, because every clause is, structured differently. Under English law, you would obviously have a test which you set out, and it depends on the drafting of that test. Sometimes you say it's the inability of parties to perform their contractual obligations. Sometimes it's the delay of it. Sometimes it's both of it. Obviously, if you have in one chain inability only and in another chain perhaps both inability and delay, then there's a mismatch. There's also a question we have been asked lately whether, for example, a second wave could be held to be unforeseeable, and therefore, even though we had a first wave, and that's obviously now out of the question to be force majeure, a second wave would be unforeseeable, and whether that could be then a force majeure claim. But we have asked council about this, and they felt there's obviously so much talk about second, third, or whatever wave that is hardly unforeseeable. Another thing which you probably have to look at is whether there are any exclusions of force majeure. So whether, for example, a reduction in the market demand is excluded as being a force majeure event. And whether perhaps, for example, people not being able to come to the port in order to operate the port facilities would then obviously be a more concrete force majeure event. So I hope that gives flavor. But actually, under the English, from what I know anyway, talking to my dispute resolution colleagues, I don't think under English courts any determination have been handed down on that yet, whether any of the force majeure claims which we have seen will be upheld.
Okay, well, a question from me, because we've heard talk of this, is some of the civil law jurisdictions have the ability of local governments or authorities to declare force majeure in their area. And obviously, that ends up with an interesting conflict of law question between the civil law local issues, say on a DES delivery, and what the English law force majeure provisions are going to say. Have you experienced that in any way?
So we've heard about certificates of force majeure being handed out by some of the Chinese entities. That's as far as perhaps it goes. I don't think we've been involved in it. And what I would like to say is that obviously your force majeure clause could deal with that. You could have a provision saying acts of government entities as defined, and then hopefully have the port authorities be part of that government entity. So then hopefully the loop is closed. Again, it needs to be passed through the contractual chain. But you could also have change of law provisions, I guess, and then hopefully get a compensation payment. Or you just step away from that market if you had enough, which is probably not feasible if it is China with the large demand they are.
Well, it's also probably not feasible if you're an aggregation, you've got a lot of LNG to get
right.
rid of. Yeah.
Indeed.
Anyway, I think we are close to the hour, so we'll wrap it up there. Thank you very much, Heike, Daisy and Joe. Just a reminder, this has been recorded and the slides and the recording will be made available to everyone who's registered. If you don't receive a copy and want to, please contact either any of us or your other Watson Farley Williams contacts, and we'll make sure you get a copy. So thank you very much for joining us. If you feel the need to hear us again, we will be doing this again next Tuesday at 4 p.m. Singapore time for an Asian audience. So please let your colleagues in Asia know. Thank you very much for joining us, and we appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.